Morning. We very much appreciate all of your assistance. I want to point out in particular Larry Rusoff, who is a new member of our congregation, so welcome. With all the live streaming and new technology of this season, I developed a new problem. I go back after each service and I watch it. And sometimes I think to myself, wow, that was a really good sermon. And sometimes I think quite the opposite. But in every case, I watch those sermons over and over again so as to see how I could get better at what I do. Should I be raising my voice more? Should I be lowering it? Should I stop screeching as much? Maybe I should slow down. Maybe I should pick up my pace. Then I realized what I have always known, and that is, this is who I am. There isn't much that I can do at this point to change the way I speak, but I can get my message a little bit clearer and a little bit better. I know that when I get excited, I start to screech. And that pretty much happens every sermon. But there isn't much I can do about it because that's how I speak. And if I try too hard to alter my style, then I'm going to be so distracted that I'll lose my content. So what happened was on May 2nd, I gave a sermon here in the sanctuary all by myself. I gave that sermon on the reading that we actually read this morning. I rewatched the sermon and thought, hey, that was a pretty good sermon. I could give that again. Jack Reamer, one of the professors at the seminary who taught homiletics, said that if a sermon was good enough to give once, it was good enough to give twice. But what he was really saying was that every sermon had to be worked so hard that you would want to give it a second time. So I thought that it was a pretty good sermon, but there was more I could have done with it. That there was a way to make that sermon better than it was when I gave it on May 2nd. And that's pretty much true of everything about everything that we do in life. And that's pretty much the message of what the High Holidays is really all about. And that is, we have a chance for a do-over. We have a chance to do it better than we did the first time. And so this morning I offer you the same exact sermon as I gave on May 2nd. I just pray it's better. And if you want, you can go to YouTube and you can find that sermon, and then you can compare. This morning we read of the ritual of the scapegoat, but it's within the context of the High Holidays that makes this reading so much more powerful. So this is how it goes. Aaron puts the name of each goat into a bag, and he reaches in and he picks out which goat will be sacrificed to God and which goat will be sent off into the wilderness to bear the sins of the Jewish people. The initial step is critical for this ritual because deciding the fate of a goat ought to be a matter of luck, not because somebody decides that goat is better than another. You know the joke. If I didn't have bad luck, I wouldn't have any luck at all. So we understand the role that luck plays in the determination of which goat will be sent out to the wilderness to die a horrific death, or which one's death will come instantaneously through sacrifice. And so Aaron leaves it up to fate. And in fact, it's this lack of responsibility that I find deplorable. In this ritual, we don't have a single objector. There isn't a single recorded evidence of someone saying, this is wrong. How can we do this? Why should some poor little goat be punished with a horrific death because of my sins? Does anybody really believe that all of our sins can simply go away by placing them on the head of a goat and sending it off to the wilderness to die of starvation. So let me take a step back for a minute. On the second day of Rosh Hashanah, we read the story of the binding of Isaac. You know the story well. Abraham is told by God to sacrifice his son. Abraham, as always, simply concedes. Wanting to fulfill the wishes of God, the eternal pleaser, Abraham, without hesitation, says, sure. And it's not until an angel appears does Abraham substitute the ram for his son. And the shofar reminds us of Abraham's willingness to kill his son. No one offers an objection. Abraham doesn't say, maybe we could do someone else. Maybe we could do something else. What does this have to be? And the symbol of the ram's horn becomes the central symbol for this high holiday season. Abraham's lack of objection. But lest you think the binding of Isaac is a singular event, the reading from the first day of Rosh Hashanah reminds us that Abraham was willing to sacrifice Ishmael, who he actually thought was the fulfillment of God's promise to him to make of him a great nation. The story is one you might remember, but maybe not, because, of course, there was no protest there either. No one really makes note of that moment. Vayashkem Avraham baboker vayikach lechem v'chimat mayim vayetein el Hagar sham al shichma v'et hayeled v'yelchehu v'yishlachehu v'telech v'teida b'midbar be'er sheva. Early the next morning, says the text, Abraham took some bread, a skin of water, and gave them to Hagar. He placed them over her shoulder. Together with the child, he sent her away, and she wandered about in the wilderness of Beersheba. He sent her away to the wilderness with just a skin of water and a little food. Sounds so familiar. You can't help but hear the first day of Rosh Hashanah on Yom Kippur, Vayishalchehu, and he sent them off. All you have to do is now complete the story. He sent them off to die. Abraham knows full well what it feels like to already sacrifice a son when he gets to the second day of Rosh Hashanah's reading, when God asks him to sacrifice a son. He knows full well what it feels like. It's the same exact language from the first sacrifice to the second sacrifice. Vayashkem Avraham baboker. He got up early in the morning. Why is that so important to us? Why is Vayashkem baboker so important? Because he had a night to sleep on it. He went to bed knowing full well what he was supposed to do the next day. And he got up early, and he did it early to get it over with. He knew what he was doing. It's not like God said to Abraham, do this, and Abraham said, let's think about it for a minute. He had a whole night to think about it. The text simply says, go and do this, and Abraham does. You can sleep on it. You can think about it all you want. You can make all the preparations. I'll even give you time to protest. And Abraham does nothing. Abraham, twice confronted with the potential sacrifice of each of his sons, simply agrees. Not a single protest. The father of our great nation, in fact, the father of two great nations. The great negotiator of peace between kings. Unable to, or maybe unwilling to, stand up and say, no, this isn't right. There's something wrong with this picture. So many times in Abraham's life, he is merely a bystander to his own life. Pharaoh wants Sarah. Abraham says, okay. God says, move to a place unknown, a place which has no familiarity to you. Give up everything you know, everything you love. Abraham says, no problem. This isn't leadership. This is a blind follower. And it's passed along from generation to generation because guess what? How many times have we said in our lives, let's not make waves. Let's not draw attention to ourselves. Let's not engage in a conflict. Let's not ruffle any feathers. Things are good for us right now. Let's not make for ourselves a scapegoat. The divisiveness and the anger is besetting our world. We know what it means to be the scapegoat. Remember, Germany, 1939. Abraham's legacy passed on to the leaders of the Jewish people in the ancient world was to pick a scapegoat. You want someone to blame for all of your problems? Pick a scapegoat. ונתן אהרון את שני השעירים גורלות, גורל אחד לאדוני וגורל אחד לעזאזל. You pick out of lots who's going to be the scapegoat. It can be anybody. One scapegoat. One goat for God, and one scapegoat for what we have done wrong. And not a single word of protest. Not a single person stood up and said, I take responsibility for my own sins. Maybe the theater of the moment was supposed to engage feelings of sympathy. Maybe what was supposed to happen at the very end of that ritual was people to stand up and say, no, don't do it. It's too horrific. Please don't hurt somebody else because of my mistakes. Don't hurt this poor little goat. The anticipation of the actual sending off into the wilderness was supposed to engender a feeling of contrition. Maybe the sight of watching the goat wander off will certainly make people think a second time as they imagine the protracted death of this animal. Maybe starvation, and then maybe it was going to be picked apart by vultures. Maybe that would animate the audience to work harder in the coming years so that the ritual didn't have to be repeated again and again and again. While this is a strong case for standing against cruelty and scapegoating, the text that really penetrates us deeply is the first sentence of the reading this morning, Vayidaber Adonai el Moshe, Acharei mot shnei bnei Haron. God spoke to Moses after the death of the two sons of Aaron. The opening of the reading this morning amplifies, it clarifies the feelings of this moment. This is a moment of life and death. The choices you make, the times you choose to stand up and the times you choose to remain silent have a dramatic, tremendous import. The way you choose to use your voice is a matter of life and death. Protests have been the marker of our free country since suffrage through civil rights and to today. We value free speech. Otherwise, people die. Last night I spoke of language that we use as a powerful tool for progress and or regression. Today I speak on the behalf of the right to protest. We must protect our right to gather peacefully. I repeat, to gather peacefully and make our voice heard. We're not sheep led to slaughter. Our days of being victim of attempted genocide are over, and we must be unafraid to use our voices against totalitarian behavior. And it depends on us whether American democracy will survive. So we have to ask ourselves three simple questions. Who am I? What am I? And where am I? Who am I? What am I? Where am I? These three questions ask us to decide what we stand for, what we stand against. They ask us for moral clarity in our lives. Do we stand against destroying the environment? Do we stand against the moral implications of our immigration laws? Do we stand against an imbalanced application of justice? Do we stand against a double standard in gender hiring practices? But we must go further in the questions that we ask. It can't be just what do we stand against. We have to also ask ourselves, what do we stand for? Do we stand for those who cannot stand for themselves? Do we stand for humanitarian efforts throughout the world? Do we stand for fighting poverty? Do we stand for the dignity of every person? Of every person. Just like the beginning of the Torah reading this morning, we're in a moment where death is everywhere. Over 200,000 people are dead here in the United States from COVID. How many are dying from other tragedies? It's time to stop pointing fingers and stand up and do something. Take some personal responsibility. Maybe if we do, then next year we won't have to go through this same exact exercise over and over again, because we then will have found a way to heal our world. Shana Tova. We continue with Chatzi Kaddish, page 298. Please rise.